So thank you very much for inviting me on to come and talk to you about health and safety. So Brinsley, I'm a co-founder of Brinsley Animal Rescue. We are approved under the Wildlife Care Badge for all species, something we're really proud of and really agree with. So if you're on this call and you're not a member, I'd strongly advise being involved. So I'm going to start off with a few introductions, talk about why health and safety is important, who it impacts, go through some practical considerations, case studies, a summary, some links for further reference, and then hopefully there's going to be a bit of time at the end to go through any Q&A. So myself, my background is I spent 38 years in the power industry, the last 17 years in offshore wind as a general manager. So I was responsible for a large offshore wind farm in the Humber Estuary out at sea. So responsible for a large multidisciplinary team. So health and safety was part of my core responsibility. I've got multiple people on boats, 2 hours offshore, working 150 meters above the sea. We've got high voltages, hydraulics, rotating parts, all kinds of things. So a very hazardous environment, not necessarily a risky environment because we've got good health and safety management systems in place to manage those hazards. So part of my role, I got an EBOS certificate. So I have, it's quite a comprehensive certificate in occupational health and safety. I gave up my job 3 years ago to be a full-time volunteer for the charity that me and my partner set up. So yeah, we set it up in 2008. We're still run by volunteers, although we're looking to potentially start employing people as we grow. We've got 27 acres at 3 locations, rescuing about 1,000 animals a year, pets, wild animals and farm animals, and we're rescuing on average about 500 pets a year. So today the talk is health and safety. It's health and safety for humans. It's not animals. That's off scope. What I'm going to talk now is really it's a summary. It's aimed at practical steps that you should take to help manage your obligations. It's by no means conclusive. So to start off with, why is health and safety important? Well, there's three main reasons: a moral obligation, a legal obligation, and also financial. So it's important that we've got volunteers. We shouldn't be putting them at risk. They give up their free time. We shouldn't be putting them under unnecessary risk. We shouldn't be hurting them. We have a legal obligation under criminal law and civil law, which I'll come on to. But poor health and safety can impact us financially through bad publicity. You can lose support. Defending a case, whether that be criminal or civil, can be very expensive and can actually cost more than the case itself through fines or compensation. And it can also lead to increased insurance. So it should be an important part of managing a charity or an organisation. You're managing your health and safety. So criminal law is offences against the state. It's an act of parliament. It's enforced by, so in our case for health and safety, it's the Health and Safety at Work Act and the subordinate regulations, which I'll come on to. It's enforced by the Health and Safety Executive, who have immense powers, and in some cases more powers than the police. It's tried in a criminal law, and where evidence is beyond all reasonable doubt, and it's punished by, like any of the criminal acts, by fines or prison. So the legislation for health and safety is the Health and Safety Work Act, and it applies to everybody who's considered to be at work, and organisations with at least one employee. So therefore, a volunteer is classed as an employee. So pretty much the Health and Safety Work Act applies for what we do. So Health and Safety Work Act, we have the Act, as I mentioned, that's what we call primary legislation. It's an Act of Parliament. It's very, very high level. It's written by lawyers. It goes through a green paper, a white paper, through the Commons, through the Lords, It's very, very high level law, and takes the time to pass through Parliament. So then what you have with Acts of Parliament is you have the supporting or the secondary legislation, which tends to be regulations. You can have multiple regulations, and that's very easy to amend. So once an act is in place, regulations come out, and there's lots of different regulations for health and safety. And then beyond that, you've got guidance, or codes of practice. And the code of practice gives a lot more detail on how you comply with the law. And it's so when you're writing procedures, you should be referring really back to the codes of practice, not necessarily the law. And a good example of that is the Road Traffic Act. So when you drive your car, when you're passing your test, you don't get the Road Traffic Act out and read it. So how do I comply with the law when I'm driving my car? You won't make head nor tail of it because it's written in very legal terms. You get the highway code, you read the highway code, that tells you practically how to comply with the law. No different to codes of practice and acts of parliament. If you commit a traffic offence, you're not prosecuted under the highway code, you're prosecuted under the Road Traffic Act. The police may say you broke the highway code, using it as evidence to say how you didn't comply with the Road Traffic Act. So it's a good analogy. So civil law, this is probably more important really, because although the Health and Safety Work Act applies, that's criminal law, the chances are if there was an incident, it's unlikely that you'd be prosecuted under criminal law. The Health and Safety executive tend to go for the big boys and set example. What's more important is civil law. So the civil law is disputes between individuals and other individuals or businesses or the state, and it focuses on compensation, not punishment. And there's a lot lower burden of proof on the balance of probabilities. So if there was an incident, a volunteer, for example, or an employee or a member of the public could take a civil claim and say, I was injured in your workplace, I want and sue for compensation. So this is probably more important why health and safety is important. It's not necessarily the legal side, although the criminal side, that is still valid. It's more likely that you'll be sued as an individual or the organization. Who does health and safety apply to? Oh, well, pretty basically everybody. So it's you. And in my past experience, in my role working, individuals can be prosecuted. And there was an incident that on one of our sites where an individual failed to comply with a process, and he injured himself, and he was very nearly prosecuted under criminal law because he failed to follow health and safety processes. And the only reason why the health and safety executive didn't prosecute him was because he'd actually lost the sight of his eye and felt he'd actually learned his lesson, and he'd suffered enough. Applies to employees. So as a trustee or a director of a CIC, your staff, your volunteers, any students, you have an obligation to them. And also the public. So if the public are coming to you, bringing in animals, they're dropping off donations, you do have an obligation to them for their health and safety. It's also important to note that volunteers themselves have a duty of care to themselves and others, and to comply with health and safety requirements. So as I mentioned earlier, the example there where an individual failed to follow procedures, and as such didn't comply with the Health and Safety Work Act. So I'm just going on to a few practical steps on. So the law still complies whether you're a small organisation with a couple of volunteers or you're a massive organisation. The legislation is still the same. What's expected of you is a little bit more different, and it's about horses for courses. It's about what the risk is. So the risk in what we do is low. You're not expected to have nowhere near the same amount of health and safety management as an organization with multiple employees with lots of risks. But you should have some basic principles, some basic steps. So really, risk management, chemicals, manual handling, electrical safety, lone working, health and safety policy. They're the sort of things I'm going to briefly cover tonight. So risk management. So what is risk management? So this is probably the most key thing, and you probably already doing it every day. You're not necessarily potentially doing it formally. So the risk management is about identifying the risks in what you're doing day to day. What are the risks? Sorry, start again. What are the hazards? So what are the hazards in what you're doing every day? Assessing the likelihood of those hazards causing harm, and then trying to eliminate or minimize the risk. In the hierarchy of risk management, you should always eliminate the risk if you can. If you can, you eliminate the risk. If you can't, you minimize the risk to an acceptable level. And we do this through risk assessment. There's a number of ways of doing risk assessments. I've got an EBOSH certificate. I'll probably do them a bit more complicated than others. You can get them far more complicated than this. And what risk assessment is basically, a lot of it you're probably already doing. So what you're doing is, and then it's formalizing it. So we're actually physically writing down what you're probably already doing. So first, identify the hazards. What are the hazards? So this is a risk assessment for the wildlife hospital general activities. So a hazard is a potential source of harm. So animals can bite, they can scratch, etc. So that's the hazard. Then you have the impact. That's the likely. That's the effects. The effects of the hazard. So is that that can potentially be, it can be high, it can be medium, it can be low. It depends on the risk. And most of what we're doing, it will be generally low impact, potentially medium impact. Next is the likelihood of that hazard causing harm. So how likely is it? So how likely is it that somebody's going to get bitten? How likely is it that that you're going to get scratched by an animal? So then you go into control measures. So what are you doing to try and minimize the likelihood and minimize the impact? And again, you're probably already doing this in many respects. It's about writing it down. It's considering, are we doing everything we can? Can we minimize that risk further? And then ultimately you have the overall risk. So the overall risk is the, I can't read my own slides. There we go. I can read it, move that out of the way. So the overall risk is the likelihood, considering the likelihood and the impact. So if the impact is high and the likelihood of that happening is high, you've got a high risk. If the impact is low, but the likelihood is medium, you've potentially got a medium, a low risk. It's fairly arbitrary. There's different ways of measuring this. So because we are in a fairly low risk environment, measuring it as high, medium, low is acceptable. In a more high risk environment, you would probably score it on a 1 to 10. So 10 could be a fatality, 1 could be a very minor injury, but that is, I think, is a pretty much overkill for what we're doing in this industry. Just to give an example, a typical hazard is biological. So how can that happen in what we're doing in this risk assessment? Well, direct contact with animals, contact with waste, or general contamination. What control measures do we have in place? Wearing disposable gloves. washing hands with antibacterial soap, covering open wounds with sores, and using zoonotic signage. So they're all pretty basic steps, which I'm sure you're already doing. So if you didn't have any of those control measures in place, you've probably got a potentially medium risk, because so the chances of somebody getting a zoonotic disease or getting an infection would be it's a medium risk. It's a very good likelihood of that happening. Whereas once you put the control measures in place, you've reduced it to a low risk. Oops. So I think I've gone on too far. Right. So risk assessment. So um, they don't have to be written. As I mentioned, you probably already doing it. You're already doing risk assessment by you've probably already got these control measures in place. They don't have to be written down. I think it's good practice to write them down, because it makes you think, is there anything I've missed? Is there better control measures I can put in place to reduce the risk? And you don't necessarily have to hand the risk assessments out to your team for them to read. They should be available. We keep ours in the volunteer room. Does anybody read them? I doubt it. What is important is those control measures. There's no point in doing a risk assessment saying I've reduced the risks to an acceptable level by providing PPE, by providing antibacterial soap, etc. There's no point in having control measures in place unless you've told people and they're implemented. And you do this by making sure they're included in your inductions, your volunteer handbooks, or whatever you use to communicate to your volunteers. Put them in your protocols and your procedures, or even just basic signage, even things like a sign up, wash your hands before you eat, wash your hands before you leave, things like that. It's about making sure they're implemented. Other typical hazards to consider in a risk assessment, for example, in wildlife hospital, is animals bite, scratch, cuts, slips, trips and falls. You can end up with wet floors. You can end up with all kinds of stuff on the floor. Dust from bedding and food, chemicals, and even potentially fire. They're all, might seem, some of these might seem like common sense, but it's important to have at least recorded them and recorded your control measures. What measures you put in place to reduce that risk. Moving on to chemicals. So that's risk assessment. So chemicals, I mentioned earlier about the Health and Safety at Work Act, and below that you've got regulations and codes of practice. You have what's called the Care of Substances Hazardous to Health regulations. They're really in depth. We have to comply with them, but the important thing is that you take basic steps relevant to the risk that we have. So we're not using gallons of solvents or paints, things like that, where you would probably have to monitor the levels within the room, so you're not going over exposure levels. That's an overkill for what we're doing, but you should be taking basic steps. So look at the labels that are on the bottles. What do those labels say? Are they corrosive? Do they recommend wearing certain PPE, so aprons, gloves, potentially glasses? If they're an eye irritant, then you should consider things like eye wash stations. So we have an eye wash station. So it's basic steps. So you don't need to do a full cost assessment. It's complicated and an overkill for the risks of what we're doing. But at least take basic precautions and look at those labels and make sure that anything that's recommended on the back of those labels, you've implemented any of your procedures, you've warned people, you've provided PPE, and you make sure that PPE is warm. Manual handling, again, there's manual handling regulations, there's manual handling guidance notes. It's all very detailed. And then if you're working in a logistics store where there's lots of manual handling, then you should have training and assessments a massive overkill for what we're doing, but you should do some basic practical steps. So the first thing is not put volunteers at risk. So during your induction process or your recruitment process, you should be asking people if they have a medical condition that you need to know about, so you don't put them at risk. So if they've got a back problem or whatever, then you should be asking them to avoid any manual handling. Take that into, if you're in any doubt, then refer them to their GP. And if you possibly can, avoid manual handling. There is very little manual handling in a hospital, but certainly picking up animals, moving any heavy equipment can be considered as manual handling. So if you can avoid it, avoid it. And if nothing else, make people aware of that risk. So they can make their own judgments whether they feel that they can't move something and they should ask, and they can ask for help. Electrical safety. So ideally, the law states we should be carrying out certify the installation. I think it's every 5 years, and portable electric equipment has to be tested every year, inspected and tested annually. So that's what we should be doing, and that's what the law requires. It's very difficult when you have a setup in your home, and you probably got volunteers coming into a spare room, a utility room, a shed. That's what the law states. And I think at minimum, what you should be doing is making sure that equipment is inspected. It's inspected, and if you've got dodgy equipment, if you can see wear and tear, it's removed from service. Ideally, it's pat tested. It's something, I'm not saying, we certainly aren't squeaky clean. We've slowly been implementing more and more and getting better. So all our electrical equipment, the installation has been tested. My house isn't, but the volunteer room and the stable block, wherever volunteers can use electrical devices, the installation has been tested. And we can do portable appliance testing ourselves. Moving on to lone working, it's something we probably didn't consider not that long ago, but it is important, because if somebody's at your site on their own and something happens, and it could be nothing to do with the activity, it could be a medical condition. If they're on their own, you're really putting somebody potentially at risk if they're on their own and nobody's checking on them, or you don't know. And it doesn't have to be very complicated. You can download apps. There are systems out there where if you've got a large team, you can check in and check out, so you know that somebody's on site, somebody's working alone, they've left. But I think that they can be an overkill for a small organization. It's something that's more tricky for us because we've got 3 sites now. But we simply just use so all our volunteers are either on Facebook Messenger, or if they're not on Facebook, they're on WhatsApp. And all they do is they send a message to the group. I'm at Brinsley Hill. I expect to leave at 12 o'clock, and then they message again to say they've left. And sometimes they forget, and I will chase them. It's just something really quite basic, but it's just a way you can keep check of people coming to site and leaving site. And actually, at the our main rescue, where most of the activity is, people will also sign in and sign out. So I know people have arrived and they've left safely, as well as having a record of people being here. And the last kind of section I'm going to cover really is health and safety policy. Might sound really boring and complicated. It's not. and there's lots of templates and guidance out there. And I think I've got a link at the end to help you write a policy. It is a legal requirement if you've got 5 or more employees, or as I mentioned earlier, an employee doesn't necessarily have to be paid. If you've got 5 volunteers, then you need a health and safety policy. Doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, you can go to the health and safety executives website. They have a template and you can fill one out fairly quickly. The policy starts off with a statement, and you may say this if you ever go into workplaces, you quite often see a health and safety policy statement, and this is a paragraph. It's maybe 1 page, and it really it's a load of wording demonstrating the trustees or the directors' commitment to health and safety. We have one. We put it in. It's actually, we've got it up in our volunteer room, although I think it's fell off the wall, but we did have one in the volunteer room. And then the general content of the policy is just sets out how you're going to manage health and safety, and who's going to do it. And it's really a lot of what's on the left. You can say it. I mean, I think bear in mind, I think we've got a lot more hazards than most organisations, because we've got tractors, we've got 4x4s, we've got farm animals. So, you know, we've got 27 acres. So our health and safety policy is probably bigger than it would for a wildlife rescue. But it's a few pages. There's not a lot there. It basically says we will carry out risk assessment, and we will communicate the findings of risk assessment to volunteers through the volunteering process, through the induction process, sorry. It will say that we will test our equipment. It will say that our fire extinguishers will be tested. Will be inspected annually, and the fire alarms will be tested annually. It's fairly basic. It's outlining really what you're doing. And I'm quite happy to share, you know, after this, I put my email address and my phone number. If you want to see what our policy, you want our policy as an example, I'm quite happy to send you a copy. You can't copy it, but obviously you can use it as a template for making it fit for your organisation. If you look at big organisations' health and safety policy, they'd be very complex, they'd be very detailed to reflect the multi-risks that an organisation would face, and multiple employees, not fit for what we need. What you need is something fairly basic. Okay, so just a couple of case studies. It's not trying to frighten people, but it's really so I don't really want to. I'm trying not to make this sound overcomplicated, health and safety, but it is important. But just a couple of case studies, really. So one of these was very recent. You may have seen it in the news. Then this was a criminal law. It was a small organisation. It was a lady. I think it was literally only a few weeks ago. It was a lady who was an ex police officer, and she set up a company, and she was paddleboarding, and they'd gone out on a river, and 4 people went over a weir into quite rough water, and 4 of them died. And she was prosecuted by the Health and Safety Executive under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and she actually went to prison for 10 years and 6 months. And that might, I mean, for me, I was quite shocked by that. I thought 10 years, that's a really small organisation. That's normal, and that's for corporate manslaughter, and that's normally aimed at big corporations who are trying to set an example. But the reason being is that there was total disregard for health and safety. And health and safety executive basically said there was nobody qualified to lead the tour. Their actual approach to health and safety was abysmal. They had completely incorrect PPE, and they completely failed to assess the risk or even communicate the risk. So they were made an example of. Under civil law, I'm aware of a rescue. I won't mention that rescue. I'm aware of a rescue, and this is so criminal law. It's unlikely. In this case, it was 4 people that had fatalities in, you could say in a quite a risky environment, going down a river in paddleboards with incorrect PPE, and in some cases, I think some have had no PPE. They didn't have life vests. They didn't have they didn't have the tethers to the boards. So for what we do, it's highly unlikely that the health and safety executive would prosecute you under the Health and Safety at Work Act. They won't make an example of you. They want to set examples with big companies. I work for big corporations, and I've been involved in multiple investigations involving the health and safety executive, including fatalities, and it's not nice. They won't go for you. What is really important to us is civil law, as I mentioned, because you have a responsibility under criminal law, the Health and Safety at Work Act. You have a liability, and if somebody is injured, they can sue you under civil law, and that's where it's more likely to impact you. So I'm aware of a charity, then they are a charity, and they were sued by a volunteer for an incident that said they're an alleged incident because they believe it never happened. It was a volunteer who they believed came a couple of times and they never saw again. But that volunteer said that they were kicked by a horse and injured, and they lost. It was fought by the insurance company. So you obviously want insurance you have third-party liability insurance, employers liability insurance for this reason. And their insurance fought the case and lost. In fact, I think they eventually just paid out because it cost more to go to court. And the reason being is that the charity had no evidence that they first identified the risk because they had no risk assessments. They could not prove that they'd warned the volunteer of any risks because they hadn't done a formal induction. And they couldn't even although they said they believed that volunteer had only volunteered 2 or 3 times, they could not prove it because they had no record. So it's partly this that's why we have an induction process. We warn people of the risks. We tell people where risk assessments are. Those risks are in what procedures we do have. And volunteers sign in, they sign out. I know who's been, and I know, I know when people have been on site and when they've left. So that's two individual case studies: criminal law, civil law. And as I mentioned, it's more likely civil law that will impact you if there is an incident. So summary, really, effectively managing health and safety is important. It shouldn't be a distraction, and people sometimes see it as getting in the way, or something's been stopped because of health and safety. Quite often that's people's overreaction. Health and safety should not stop you doing something. And in the case study I just mentioned with the paddleboarding incident, the health and safety executive actually said they do accept there's risk involved. The problem with that incident and why that lady was prosecuted and imprisoned is because she failed to manage that risk in any way, shape or form, or communicate it. So if you don't have anything in place now, you probably have a lot more than you think because you're going through that process. You've probably already done your risk assessment. You've got your control measures. You haven't physically written it down formally. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be fairly simple. It's fine. Think if you haven't got other things in place, the thing to do is really just prioritize where is your biggest risk and then slowly put measures in place. Don't get overwhelmed by it. Don't think that liability waivers are going to help. I've been zip wiring and whitewater rafting and things, and they often get you to sign a waiver at the beginning. It's not worth the paper it's written on. If you have a legal obligation to somebody, that is law. signing something does not supersede law. A liability waiver has no defence in your obligations. Ensure you have adequate insurance, as I mentioned, so you're more likely to be sued under civil law, therefore compensation, than charity law, than criminal law. So insurance, if you've got the correct insurance with employers' liability for volunteers and third-party liability for the public. And then that point there I mentioned about consider what you do when you're at home. It's a real dilemma, a real grey area when you run a rescue from home, which we do, because you got your home insured, your own insurance, but that probably doesn't cover you for visitors. If the visitors come in, they're visiting you, and they have an injury, they fall over, you're probably covered. But if that person's bringing an injured animal to you, to your organisation, you're probably not. You most likely, you would need separate insurance. So just be clear with your insurance policy, with the insurer, what are you covered for? So what we do is I go to one broker and I have two policies. And the good thing about that is that it doesn't matter if there is an incident and it goes to insurance. It doesn't matter whether they're a visitor coming to volunteer or that volunteer happens to be my friend and they're visiting for a barbecue. I'm covered by the same policy. I'm covered by the same company. They're not going to argue. They're not going to try and push the responsibility from one to another. Health and safety should not be a paper exercise. So don't just do this to comply with the law or do this to stop you being sued. It's important. So it's not just a paper exercise. So it's make sure that the outcomes of all this are in your inductions, any of your training handbooks, any of your protocols, your procedures, your day-to-day. And then make sure you set the standard. And you set, you lead by example. On my next slide, there we go. So there's some links on there which by all means go to. There's a good link there for the Health and Safety Executive website for risk assessment templates. So I'm quite happy to share the template that I've used. You can actually use much more basic risk assessments. I don't think you need the complicated ones. So sometimes they're really, really complicated. It's not needed for the level of risk with what we do. A link there for health and safety for volunteers and another link there for preparing a health and safety policy. And finally, thank you very much. And it's Q&A now, and there's my email address, my phone number. Like I say, I'm quite happy to. So I'm sure Alana will send out this slide pack. I'm quite happy to send any other information, but some of our health and safety policy statement, and I think our health and safety policy may actually be on our website as a PDF, but I'm quite happy to share that. It's, we should be sharing things like that and working together, and you can use that as an example if you haven't got one already. Thank you.